Hello class, this is Professor McDonald, and this will be the, if we look at our objectives, we're going to examine, and in this particular slide, this is more of an introductory slide, has a couple of quick points. Terrorism in the name of religion has become the predominant model for political violence. We've seen that before. In one of our prior chapters we read, we are now in the religious wave of terrorism. When you think of in the modern era too, what we're going to see is, as we get later into this presentation, religious terrorism can also be offensive or defensive. So that's something that we'll cover as well. And we've seen the decline of what we call secular terrorism, which is non-religious terrorism. Our next point is religious terrorism is a type of political violence that is motivated by the absolute belief that an otherworldly power has authorized and directed the application of terrorist violence for the greater glory of the faith. And what we're talking about here is God. The actions are justified because they are sanctioned by God. And individuals that partake are participants in religious terrorist violence. Their acts will be forgiven. No matter how violent, the rewards await them in the afterlife. So, like in the Muslim religion, when they go, they'll be cleaned of any sins that they had. They'll be young women, honey, whatever. These are the things that are promised to those that become martyrs of the faith. And this is not something that just came about, as we'll talk about when we start talking about the Christian Crusades, when we look at some of the historical perspectives. Next slide. Why do you think it's the predominant model in the new terrorism? Because the old ideologies have sort of faded away. In particular, if you look at Islamic fundamentalist terrorism today, and we will have a slide of this later, but let me just introduce you to it. There were different phases. The anti-colonialism phase, where Arab nationalists resisted the presence of European forces, and this is the colonial era, where you had sometimes wars of independence in that part of the world, and secular governments were established. And secular, again, meaning non-religious. You had a movement of pan-Arab nationalism, and you also had secular leftist radicalism, which kind of promoted Marxism and socialism ideas. But what eventually happened is, to many in the Muslim world, these waves, these modern era waves, these secular phases, did not deliver what they expected, because they felt that the Muslim nation, looking at it as a whole, Muslim people, Middle East, whatever, had not earned or had not acquired the global respect that they were due. They kept losing battles with the Israelis, especially for the fundamentalists, their number one enemy, and they felt still a strong influence of Western influence, which had subjugated Muslims throughout the world. And so what ultimately happens is you see the emergence of a more radical movement, where the Islamic extremists step into this void, and that would be your groups like Al-Qaeda, your groups like the Islamic State. They step into this void and try to promise change that will lift the Muslim world to the level that it should be in their eyes, as compared to the rest of the world. And for many of us, we should be able to go back to the Ottoman Empire, when Muslims ruled a large portion of the world. So these are just some of the historical perspectives. Is it strictly religious? No. You have primary and secondary. For some of them, religion is the driving force. For others, it could be politics, and religion is a secondary support that they use. In other words, we want political change, and religion will be their secondary motivation as to why they're engaging in violence. And where in the world is it prevalent? Well, we've looked at the global terrorism databases. If you look at the Middle East, if you look at South Asia, that's where most of our events are occurring, our terroristic events. Next slide. This is a chart. I'm not going to go through it too much. You can read this for yourself out of the textbook. And it talks about the, and that's something you have to think about as well. When you look at the comparing religious and secular terrorism, some of the key points, going to the top line, religious, quality of violence, unconstrained scale of terrorists. What does this mean? If they could use a nuclear bomb, they would. You don't see the selective individual targets, the more refined targets relative to individuals, etc. You see anybody is fair game. The soft targets, women, children, innocents, people that aren't combatants in any sort of a war environment, and the use of violence is as violent as you can make it. Expansive target definition, that again is expanding it to the non-warrior, say, or non-military. Anybody is a target. Their profile they want to appeal, their constituency will be those, especially for Islamic religious terrorists, would be that very refined group of Muslims in the world, very small group of Muslims that support the hard-line fundamentalist interpretation of the faith, and they are the true believers, and they are true believers in the faith that they support, and anyone else is a non-believer in their eyes. And again, indiscriminate use of violence, unconstrained choice of weapons and tactics, etc. When you go into the secular mode, you see more focused target definition, constrained violence, assassinations, things of that nature, not let's detonate a bomb that kills 500 people. Normally their constituency profile would be for the champion group. They can perceive themselves as liberators. But you can just review that, and just one of the key things you should take away from this, of course, is the when you look at the unconstrained violence versus constrained, the expansive target definition versus more focused targets with the secular terrorist activities, that sort of thing. Next slide. Now let's take a quick look, and this is just a quick list, and we're going to go through these in other slides, historical perspectives on religious violence, and I think it's important to remember, if you look at the Islamic State today, you would think with some of their crucifying people, beheading people, killing Christians, killing children, killing women, they almost have a Middle Ages, medieval savagery to their activities. And interestingly enough, they connect many of their interpretations back to the very early days, the very literal translation of some of the early Islamic writings. Now this, I'm not going to talk too much about the Islamic State because it's really not covered that much, but that's what we're talking about. And so when we look at the historical perspective here from a Judeo-Christian antiquity, if you can go back to the ancient times, the ancient Hebrews. In particular, they talk about Joshua and the conquest of Canaan in the Bible. And in those days, not only here, obviously, in what's modern day Israel, but in those days, also during medieval days, days of the Middle Ages, the Roman Empire, whatever you want to, the ancient times is what I like to refer to it as. When you defeated an enemy, it was a complete annihilation of the enemy. And of course, with Joshua, it was a complete annihilation of the enemy nations in the name of faith. He was his conquest of the cities of Canaan were required to fulfill God's commitment to the Israelites, the chosen people, to establish their covenant with God. And so therefore, and I like this quote that they use, and this is right from the Bible, no one left who breathed. There was no one left who breathed. So in a sense, they killed everyone. They killed the soldiers that they fought against. They killed the non-combatants, the women and children. No one left who breathed. So if we were to define that today, we would probably call it genocide, communal terrorism, whatever. But again, there is some historical perspective to this, and you have to look at that. Next, we're also going to talk about the Crusades a little bit, the assassins out of Persia, some of the modern Arab Islamist extremism, and we'll get into these with later slides. Next slide. And of course, we have the Crusades. When you look at the Christian Crusades, as our textbook says, it occurred during the Middle Ages. There were actually 9 invasions. They were not defensive in nature. They were offensive. The goals was to capture the Holy Land from the Muslims. In those days, they called them the Saracens. And again, these crusades were religious, had religious undertones, and it was in accordance with God's wishes that the Christians go forward and take back these holy lands from the Muslims who now occupied them. Pope Urban II, he was a Roman Catholic Pope. He's the one that offered this call to arms for Christian soldiers to go to these lands, or Christians themselves. They promised them land, fame, booty. If you died, you could die in the name of the cross. You were promised martyrdom, and that martyrdom included a remission of all your sins. So you had eternal salvation when you went through. If you believed in eternal salvation, when you went to heaven, because you martyred yourself in defense or for the religion, you therefore had no sins, and you were promised a place in heaven or that eternal salvation. And again, it was the same deal. If during the Crusades, if either side captured a city, all the inhabitants would be killed. Many atrocities, but again, this is not today. What you're seeing today is the Islamic State using techniques and tactics and savagery that goes back thousands of years when the world was much less civilized. But again, in the name of faith, terroristic activities that were occurred even back in those ancient times. Next slide. There was also a group in the book they talk about and that's where the word assassination comes from. It was the Order of Assassins from 11th century Persia. Killed many people, including Muslims. They were very adept at disguise and stealth. And if their belief was, if you lost your life, you were losing your life for a righteous cause, which was a good thing. And so, again, when we hear about, and let me just digress for a minute, when we hear about Muslims talking about if they martyr themselves as suicide bombers, then they get that eternal, they get that free ticket to heaven. Well, that's not something they just came up with. Again, if we look at the Christian Crusades and we look here at the Order of Assassins in Persia, the same ideology, the same promises were made to individuals back in those days who were willing to die for their faith. Next slide. That's a picture of the LRA is the Lord's Resistance Army. We're going to talk about them here in a little bit. But that's a group out of Africa, a terrorist group known for their recruitment of child soldiers, using young women as slaves, wiping out communities, killing masses of people, operating in Uganda. The army itself, and I want to hold off right for a second. Let's talk about another aspect, the modern Arab Islamist extremists. So we've seen that progression that I mentioned earlier, progression from the secular phases of Arab nationalism to now what we see, this religious movement, this religious wave today. You had that anti-colonial period. You had the pan-Arab nationalism, which was espoused by former Egyptian President Nasser. He advocated one single united Arab republic. And then you had the secular leftist radical which promoted more of Marxism and socialism ideas within that world, within the Arab world. And as it turned out, the perception was that these movements, although important, these secular movements, this is the perception that the radical Islamists would profess today, that these movements did not elevate the Arab people, did not elevate the modern Muslim, did not get rid of the infidel from our territories, allowed us to continue to be taken advantage by Western powers, allowed Western powers to embed their Western culture into the Islamic culture. These things failed, so therefore you see the emergence of more of a radical movement. And you also see a group like the Lord's Resistance Army, which is totally different in Africa, an organization that's kind of built on mysticism, rebellion. Joseph Kony what is the leader of that group. They want to overthrow the government, very brutal, genocidal against the tribes that they had targeted, use of child soldiers. They wanted to purify the people. Again, and mass murder, mass rape, 30,000 kidnapped children, 1.6 million displaced into camps. This is the effect these groups can have. And once they took power, they would rule under the principles of the Ten Commandments. Next slide. Picture of the Ku Klux Klan. Again, mysticism. When you look at the burning of the cross, you see the traditions that the Klan went through, wearing the robes, burning the cross, some of the leadership positions that they created for themselves, the exalted Cyclops, and different other unusual, I would say, what you would call unusual titles that you would give to individuals. But nonetheless, there's always a mystical aspect of it, a religious undertone with the cross, even with organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. Next slide. Another thing they talk about in the book was a document that allegedly originated in Russia. It was called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. This is a case of religious scapegoating. It was a forged document prepared by the secret police of the Tsar, and this document, of course, told of a plan by the Jews and the Freemasons to rule the world. And these type of documents can scapegoat a group, perhaps like the Jews, and the focus, what ultimately occurred was your anti-Semitic groups, your anti-Jewish groups, used this document to justify the repression of European Jews. Even Hitler and his National Socialist movement used the protocols extensively as justification for their actions against the Jews, because the Jews, according to this, again, forged document, the Jews had an ultimate plan to take over the world. You also see other conspiracy theories like the Holocaust denial, and that's where your Nazis, your neo-Nazis, even Klan members made arguments that the Holocaust never did occur. It was just something that was created to bring sympathy to the Jews. There's a discussion about that on page 145 of our text. When we look at the practice of religious terrorism, we're going to talk about a couple of different elements. We'll talk about jihad, and we'll talk about state-sponsored religious terrorism and dissident, of course, below-state religious terrorism in the modern era. Next slide. Before I start talking about this, I do want to mention jihad, because I'm not sure if I have a separate slide on this. There's an interesting discussion in the textbook. There's also a film that you'll have to watch. It's pretty illuminating with it. That involves an imam a Muslim imam here in the United States who's on a television show talking about jihad. But what jihad really means is it's constantly misinterpreted by the radical Islamic fundamentalist Muslims, misinterpreted for their own purposes. But jihad, what it really means is the struggle within oneself. The struggle within oneself to, essentially to do God's will, to live a good life. You have two kinds of jihad. You have the greater jihad, which is the struggle within oneself. There's a lesser jihad, which is the outward defense of Islam, and that would include military defense if you're a Muslim and you're in a country that's being attacked by another country, or even somebody that's not a Muslim, then you have a right to defend your country and your faith, no different than anyone else. All right, this particular slide, this is an interesting attack. It had a tremendous impact on Pakistani-Indian relations. Occurred between November 26th and 28th of 2008. It happened in Mumbai, which is the largest city in India, financial hub of India. And it shows where 10 well-armed and determined terrorists, they were coming from Pakistan, could actually tie up a major city like that for 3 days. They actually landed from the sea. They came in on like rubber dinghies. They were armed with small arms, as you see there, hand grenades and explosives. They attacked hotels, nightclubs, Jewish centers. That in the slide there it says 90 people killed. Well, actually the total was more like 160 people killed, hundreds injured. They were linked to a terrorist group in Pakistan called Lashkar-e-Taiba, which means Army of the Pure. One of the terrorists survived, and he confessed. What's interesting here is I've actually listened to an audio tape where the terrorists had hostages, and they were actually talking on cell phones and communicating with their handlers over in Pakistan, who were telling them who to kill and what to do, where to go next. It shows the, here in this case, terrorists, religious terrorists, using the advantage of technology to help them carry out a very successful attack as far as they were concerned. And this type of attack, India and Pakistan do have issues, political issues, and also religious issues. Pakistan is a Muslim country. India is a Hindu country. There's many different tribes, many different ethnic groups within the two countries, so there's always been a lot of conflict over land, etc., and religion. So when these gentlemen were identified as coming from Pakistan, that obviously had an impact on political relations between the two countries. Next slide. Just a kind of little, there's a quick video there you can listen to about Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American terrorist who actually went over and was living in Yemen, making speeches, trying to recruit individuals to join the jihad against America, a very outspoken critic of America, a viable target, and he was killed in a drone strike. The United States killed him several years ago. Remember, the greater jihad, struggling within oneself to do what is right, just like we all do. The lesser jihad, the outward defense of Islam. And again, what the Islamics, radicals do today is they use that lesser jihad, they take a literal translation from the Quran and say that any Muslim country that's being in war or being attacked, or even in a civil war, or like what happened in Afghanistan between the Russians and the Afghanis years ago, that is a justification for Muslims worldwide to come up and travel to that location and help fight, because this is a holy war. It's not just a civil war between groups or a war of liberation or a revolution. Anytime a Muslim country is engaged in a conflict, an armed conflict with a non-Muslim entity, organization, state, whatever, then that becomes a holy war, and it's the duty of all Muslims throughout the world to go to these places. And that's why you see today on television, it seems like once every couple of weeks the FBI picks up somebody that was trying to travel to Syria from the United States to join up with the Islamic State, or go to Somalia to join up with Al-Shabaab or any of the other, or Al-Qaeda. These are Muslims that have been radicalized, and they want to go join the fight, and that's one of their propaganda tools that they use. Those who engage in jihad are called mujahideen, and this comes from a term, or it means holy warriors. I think we've talked about that before. And much of it goes back to the 1980s, when the Russians, there was a Marxist government in control of Afghanistan. It was involved in a civil war with the Muslims in Afghanistan, in particular groups like the Taliban. It wasn't the Taliban at that time, but it was a Muslim organizations. They called them different names, but they called themselves Holy Warriors. And as the Russians invaded to prop up this Marxist leftist government, they engaged. What ultimately occurred was a battle between the Russian forces. At the time it was the Soviet Union, not Russia as we know today, and the Mujahideen, the Holy Warriors, the Islamic warriors that were from Afghanistan. But many of the warriors that were fighting in that battle were not Afghanis. These were these Arabs that had gone from various places like Saudi Arabia, other places in the Middle East. They had traveled to Afghanistan to fight alongside the Afghani Muslims in this, quote, holy war. And they were successful. Eventually the Russians got tired. They pulled out. And so the Mujahideen looked at this as a victory, and the United States was known to back the Mujahideen at that time, because that was back during the Cold War days, and we backed whoever was against the Soviet Union. And many of those that learned their combat skills in Afghanistan later came back and joined groups like Al-Qaeda to continue the holy war against the infidels. And Osama bin Laden was involved in those actions. I think he was mostly involved from a financial standpoint, helping raise money for the Mujahideen, but he actually traveled and was in Afghanistan. And from there, he ultimately formed Al-Qaeda. So that became a war that was a breeding ground for the future Mujahideen, or the future jihadist warriors. Next slide. It's important to remember as well that religious terrorism can also extend to state sponsors of terrorism. And there's none greater in the world today than Iran. In particular, they have their Revolutionary Guard Corps unit called the Quads, which means Jerusalem Force. They promote Islamic revolution abroad and the liberation of Jerusalem from non-Muslims. So, I mean, that's more of a patronage model. They're not ashamed to admit that they have these individuals involved trying to promote the Islamic revolution. Remember, Iran went through a revolution in 1979. They got rid of the Shah of Iran, and they replaced it with the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is a religious-based government. It is not a secular government, and they want to export this type of government throughout the region. When I was working in the Middle East, in places like Jordan and Bahrain, I remember talking with the law enforcement, the military personnel that I encountered when we were training, and I asked them in both countries, who do you fear in this region? Do you fear Al-Qaeda or whatever? And their greatest fear was from Iran. And that was from both locations, Jordan and Bahrain. They both feared Iran much more than they ever feared Saddam Hussein or Al-Qaeda, because of the influence that Iran could provide and their exportation of their revolution. The Iranians also are Shia Muslims. I've got a slide later, whereas the rest of the Middle East primarily is Sunni, except for Syria and parts of Lebanon with Hezbollah. Again, what are their goals of the Quads? Liberate Jerusalem from the Jews, promote the revolution, the Islamic revolution abroad. They have Iranian martyrdom units that, if the time is right, would target the United States or Israeli targets. They also support this is a little unusual too, because the Palestinians are Sunni Muslims, but they support Palestinian Islamists like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad by providing logistics, training, and support. Anything that goes against Israel. Next slide. I've already talked about Pakistan and India. This will give you an idea of how small the percentage of Shia Muslims is versus Sunni Muslims in the world. And again, the main focus of the Sunni Muslims, of course, is their location there in Iran. But if you look at the vast majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni Muslims. Next slide. Don't forget, we have dissident religious terrorism, and that would be your religious zealotry in the Middle East, convergence of claims by Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, competing claims to Israel. In other words, you have the Israelis saying that, hey, we have Israel, Jerusalem is ours, and so you have groups like the Palestinian groups and other Islamic fundamentalists throughout the world that would like nothing better than to see the destruction of the Israeli state. Jerusalem has always been a hot point. Even if we go back to the Christian Crusades, that's the Pope was sending the knights during the Crusades down into the Middle East to recapture Jerusalem. So Jerusalem has always been a prize for going back to the Christian Crusades, the Ottoman Empire, and into modern days. And again, I've already talked about the Afghan Arabs and the international Mujahideen. Next slide. Then we have Al-Qaeda. The base is what it means. Interpret into English, a movement and loose network inspired by Osama bin Laden's worldview that the Islamic armed resistance is required. He believed in a pan-Islamic revolutionary organization. Now, Al-Qaeda is a little bit different. They hold no territory. They do not champion the aspirations of an ethno-nationalist group. They've evolved into a cell-like structure. We've talked about that. Not your typical triangle top-down structure like you would see like in the military, where you have a general on top and the privates on the bottom. Virtually no state sponsorship, vague political demands, and a very religious worldview. Again, they too have talked about establishing a Muslim caliphate throughout the Muslim world, the expulsion of all Western interest. One of the things that upset Osama bin Laden the most is during the first Gulf War back in 1991, the fact that the monarchy in Saudi Arabia allowed United States troops to use Saudi Arabia as a launching point to go into Iraq to go after Saddam Hussein after Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. Again, Osama bin Laden he's a Saudi originally, a very wealthy Saudi, formed Al-Qaeda group in 1988, moved the group to the Sudan for approximately 5 years, then it ultimately ended up in Afghanistan where he was when 9/11 occurred. One of the big differences you'll see between Al-Qaeda and Islamic State is Al-Qaeda really has cut back on and put out the word they don't want to kill other Muslims, whereas the Islamic State, if you don't follow or adhere to their version of Islam, then you're no different than a non-believer and worthy of being executed. Next slide. When we look at our dissidents, you also have to look at some of your cults. One of the more infamous cults is Shinriko, which was the Japanese-based cult founded in 1987 by Shoko Ashara. They had a large group. I mean, it peaked 9,000 members in Japan and 40,000 worldwide. They're most known, their infamous Tokyo subway sarin nerve gas attack, and that was on March 20th, 1995. Almost 20 years ago. There were, our book says 12 dead, 13 dead, and approximately 5,000 to 6,000 people injured in this attack. They actually attacked 5 trains. They had gas cylinders in those trains containing the sarin gas, and they punctured them with umbrella points. They were all captured, and that cult pretty much, even though I believe it still exists in some format today, nothing like it was, especially after their leader was arrested. Next slide. Just a picture of the group and their leadership. It's a good table to take a look at when we look at dissident terrorist groups. We look at Shinriko, which is in their profile. They were more of a apocalyptic type organization, the end of the world, Armageddon. You have the Lord's Resistance Army out of Uganda, dealing with tribal targets, the Akoli tribe, the Palestinians, the Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf, which is a Al-Qaeda affiliate in the Philippines, targeting the Philippine government, Western influence. They've been known for some real infamous kidnappings of Westerners and execution of some of their captives. And then there's, I'll let you read through, but you can see some of the other groups here in that particular religious terrorism. Just these are dissident groups below state. Next slide. What's the future? What are the trends? Again, we still have that international global threat. Religion is a central feature of the new terrorism. Asymmetrical warfare, cell-based structures, soft target focus, high-yield weapons. We have a new generation of Islamists that has been primed. Al-Qaeda has become more than just an organization, but more of a global network phenomena. The jihad movement itself is global, and now we see groups like the Islamic State evolve. I believe they were created around 2006, and they evolved out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And I believe that should wrap it up for this chapter.